I said, "You're fired." And he couldn't believe it. And he said, "Why?" But he didn't have money like that at that point. I said, "This is the best game I've ever played in. I make those decisions. You know, you could have made $200,000 or $300,000, but anyway, so that we did argue." There was so much hustling and cheating in Las Vegas at the time that Eric's talking about. As a matter of fact, I promised myself I'd never play poker in Vegas. I played at the Stardust, got cheated there, went to the Dunes and saw the stud game they played with the peephole in the sky and all that. And I just didn't play poker for many years. And everybody suspected of all the cheating, and once in a while we'd catch something, but we wouldn't have known how people were really just hustling and cheating each other if Danny hadn't gotten religion. But once he got religion, he just copped everything, told everyone he cheated. I mean, he even, like, chipped, and he brought 2 girls home, played them gin. The girls got money if they won, and obviously what Danny and Chip got if they lost. But they were beating Danny and Chip. And I can tell these stories with Mindy here, right? But anyway, and Danny said, but there was no way. Yeah, right. One of the reasons that Mike might have never beat Danny, and Chip didn't beat Danny either. You know, Chip's one of the few people Danny kept. You know, the first time Chip met Danny, Danny beat him out of his money, but Chip owed him. Chip said he stayed in his house for a week as Danny drove by in his car. We were waiting for Chip to come out to collect. But it might have not always been on the square. Even though Danny had the talent, he had another thing behind. So with these girls, Danny said once they got ahead, it looked like they were going to win. They were pretty good gin players. Of course, then Danny cold decked them. You know, did the old thing in gin where you put the 4 kings on the bottom, and you get 2, they get 2, and you just wait till they break them, and then you get their king. You know. But like I say, we found out about all these stories about taking weights out of people's golf clubs and everything that happened. And one thing you were saying about his Bible studies. You know, once I started staking the game, he's getting, he made a couple $100,000. And I'd say, Danny, you should be in good shape now, right? You know, we cut out a couple $100,000. He'd say, no, I don't have much money. I'd say, where did the money go? And he and Mindy take the kids out, and like most poker players, now they had money, want to spoil the kids, they buy these hats at amusement parks that are ridiculously priced, everything that the kids want. And then, of course, he had his Bible study, which you wouldn't think would cost that much. I'm not religious, and when religious people in my family, obviously friends, Danny among them. And for my own self, my litmus test about religion is if people are using it to make themselves better, that's a good thing. If they're using it to judge other people, then I'm not so keen on it. Like you see in the world nowadays, people use it against people instead of to improve themselves. Danny certainly used it to improve himself and save himself, for sure. And the other thing I'm always suspicious of are like televangelists on TV make a lot of money. And they say they're making a lot of money off it. Obviously I don't trust as much as some guy, helping people like, priests and people that I know, nuns, that I trust them, that they're not driving, $100,000 cars. Danny is one of the few, not only did he not make money, he lost a lot of money. And what he did is, if you came to his Bible study, like Eric was saying, you'd get staked. If you accepted the Lord, Jesus Christ, whatever you say, and all those types of things. And so we got all these like degenerates, and it didn't matter what religion or atheist, whatever, and they'd listen to a sermon, and Danny said, you accept the Lord as your Savior, whatever. If they said yes, here's your stake, go to the game. And so actually, Danny had 100% conversion rate. I don't think there's any other preacher who can say that. And of course, as far as, after a while when he got on the drugs, Chip got off before Danny, and Chip staked Danny only under one condition, that Danny didn't do drugs. But Chip, of course, knew rightly not to trust Danny. Danny would always swear he didn't do anything, although his play would often indicate that there was something funny going on. Like he was being staked one time, he got in his pot, he had a draw. And anyone who plays 7 stud knows if you got position on the guy, Jasper knows it better than anyone in the room, actually. And he bets, let's say, on 5th Street. You'll raise, and a lot of times the guy will think maybe you have a better hand than maybe a trips or something, and he'll call. Then if you hit on the 6th Street, like let's say you had 2 to flush up, now you hit the 3rd flush card on board with your 2 cards in the hole, you might have made a flush. Now you'll get a bet in on 6th Street. If you miss, you'll check. And it really wouldn't have cost you because the guy would have bet twice anyway. It's a standard stud move. So Danny knew that move better than anyone. And he raised, but the guy had trips, and the guy, thought he had the best hand unless Danny had his highest card, trips the highest card. Guy raised back, Danny raised again, guy raised back. They went 17 bets on 5th Street with Danny having a draw and the other guy having a set. And so now, finally, the other guy believed him and stopped. And I think it was Sarge who was taken in that game? Sarge, yeah. And so Sarge is at the table watching this. They go 17 bets. Now on 6th Street, Danny blanked, didn't hit. And he winks at Sarge when the guy checks, Danny checks, and he winks and says, I got the free one. So, poker players will understand that. Another situation where religion saved Danny in real form is that Danny got robbed several times at gunpoint because when you do drugs, as anyone has seen Breaking Bad or those who do the drug, you have to usually go into the bad part of town to buy the drugs. This happened to Danny on several occasions. But one of the times, he had got held up as he went in this neighborhood, and the guy put a gun to his head, and Danny gave him the money out of his pocket. And the guy said, I know you got more than that. And Danny said, no, I didn't. And the guy said, I'm going to blow your head off. And he had the gun pointed at him, and then the door was open, and he saw a Bible at the foot of the car, right? And the guy says, what's that? And Dan says, that's the Bible. I'm a born-again Christian. And the guy says, you're kidding me. I am too. He says, I'll tell you what, I was going to blow your head off. That saved you. You're a man of the Lord. I can't do it. And Danny swears he would have got killed. And he's also happy to say he was bluffing. He had $5,000 in the glove compartment. But it was just another bluff he pulled off. He wasn't about to give it. And Danny, you've heard Eric tell some stories. Danny was like the master of, when someone would make these bets where they're on the river where they're on a draw, Danny would call even if he couldn't beat the guy's board. And what he would do, and people who play the game know, that a draw at that point with 1 card to go was never going to be a favorite over a made hand. Danny would call, and before the guy looked, he'd always say, you want to chop it. And the guy would say, well, if he called, let's say the guy had like a pair of 10s on the board and had a 4 flush. Danny called, he obviously could beat the 2 10s. So, it's got to be right to chop, so the guy would always chop with it. Well, Danny couldn't even beat the 2 10s. But he would just call for the chop in these situations when he couldn't beat the board. Danny won more pots where he couldn't beat the board than anyone in poker history. And then to make it even better, I think at the Commerce and maybe in Vegas too, they started putting a rule for tourists. If you call on the river and you can't beat the board, it's an obvious mistake. You never would call on the river, you can't beat someone's board. Well, this was just playing into Danny's wheelhouse. Because now, Danny could call on the river, and if the guy wouldn't take the chop, he'd say, well, what's the card room rule here? And of course he'd get a ruling, oh, I misread my hand, I can't even beat the 10s. And then they'd say, oh, you get your last bet back. So they had this rule, but they had to make the Danny Robison exception. And that's Danny doesn't get the benefit of the rule of calling someone when he can't beat the board, because covered the part. I was going to talk about Danny. Certainly was not cheap, giving away all his money. I got the water bill, the fur coats, did everything. So that one got covered. Chip knew about all. Of course, anyone who knew Danny, and when I already Danny's reputation preceded him. By the time I knew Danny, I knew if Danny offers you a chop, you don't take it. You can't ever deal with Danny. And even some great players like, Oppenheim's not here, we're playing the big game, a guy who never is going to get hustled. Danny used to do this thing like when he was about to go all in, where he'd say, oh, I only have one bet left, let's just put it in ahead of time. One bet we're both going to, and you just knew he didn't deal with Danny, but he was just so convincing that I remember one time there was a big argument where Danny said, oh, we're putting the money in, right? And Owen says, no, we're not putting the money in. I want to look at my river card. Danny said, no, you have to put it in. You put it in, and gets an argument and all the thing, and of course it's the usual fake Danny argument. Finally, again, Oppenheim saves the last bet because he doesn't improve his hand, and Danny turns over nothing. So Chip knew, being his roommate, you don't ever deal with Danny. And Danny claims the only time that they were ever together that Chip accepted a deal was they picked up these two hookers, and Danny is saying, on this side of the room, please don't listen to this story, okay? But anyway, Danny is saying to Chip, I really like the girl you're with. And Chip said, well, if you really do, they just got back to their place. Okay, I'll swap. And Danny even thought, he said, that's strange. Chip has never swapped anything, never made a deal with me first time. They go to their respective rooms. Danny does what I think is commonly called the reach around and finds some male anatomy and realizes that Chip swapped him into a transvestite. So he swears to this day that Chip knew what was up.